We are very, very privileged to have Andrew Samuels kicking off the conference. Andrew is a Jungian psychotherapist who's built up a practice as a political consultant, working with leaders, parties, and activist groups in several different countries. He was one of the two co-founders of Psychotherapists and Counsellors for Social Responsibility, and is also a former chair of the UK Council for Psychotherapy. He's Professor of Analytical Psychology at the University of Essex and a Jungian training analyst, and his many books have been translated into 21 languages. And the relevant ones are on our bookstall today, not for sale, but so that you can peruse. Titles like The Political Psyche, Politics on the Couch, and A New Therapy for Politics. He has a website, if you Google Andrew Samuels, which is well known for its rants, as he calls them, which are spontaneous talks on a range of topics. Andrew.
Thank you. Today's talk is far from spontaneous. It's a very meaningful time to hold a conference like this, isn't it? As climate change slips ever further down many or even most political agendas, despite the Marrakesh Proclamation. Here's a summary of the 20-minute talk that follows. First, I'll link up some aspects of what I call therapy thinking and climate change. Then, in the second section, I will assert that it's time to praise humanity and human artifice, not to bury them, and pick out some items well deserving of praise. The next and third section takes a look at the political desirability and advocacy of sacrifice by those able to manage it, and sets this in an economic context. Finally, I will probe what I see as a sort of addiction to apocalypse operating in the West right now. And here, following John Crace in The Guardian, here is the summary of the summary. First, therapy. Second, praise. Third, sacrifice. And fourth, apocalypse. Therapy thinking and climate change. In assigning me this title, which they did, the organisers have given me an unlikely task. Do climate activists and do therapists ever really want to be in the centre of the people, in the centre of a real mass movement? Can they be happy anywhere except on the margins? Or if they do struggle to move into the mainstream, aren't they inevitably going to betray their values and ideals or waste their time? Or, as George Marshall, a major environmental writer, noted in his critique of Leonardo DiCaprio's environmental film Before the Flood, those celebrities and big names warning of the climate change catastrophe that looms are simply making things worse. Why? According to Marshall, they ignore completely the global zeitgeist of popular cynicism about political leaders and institutions, and this is the four of them at Trump's wedding. So, I have been developing what I call therapy thinking in relation to politics for more than 30 years in too many books for comfort. This is a recent edited one, Analysis and Activism, Social and Political Contributions of Jungian Psychology. I've pointed out that such an activity is truly transpersonal, for politics, like spirit and soul, links people to each other and to whatever else is on our planet. Actually, you know, therapy thinking in the context of climate change is suspiciously easy. therapists always find it easy to be right when it comes to politics, because they invoke the maddening rectitude of the psychotherapist, in which the goal is to prove one's cherished theories, archetypes, object relations, self-actualization, to prove them correct above all else. This is why every single psychoanalytic comment on Donald Trump has been 100% correct, even when they contradict. It is easy to be right. Some of the recent history of therapists' engagement with climate change has not been inspiring or reassuring. As the ex-chair of UKCP, United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy, who encouraged the creation of a climate change policy as part of a diversity, equality, and social responsibility agenda, I can only regret and deplore what seemed to have happened when the proposed climate change policy went to the following board, not my board. Tree Staunton, who co-wrote the policy with our Judith, quotes some dispiriting responses by members of the board in a recent piece on the matter. For example, this is a minority view. There isn't sufficient grassroots support. That's in the psychotherapy profession. What does this have to do with psychotherapy? And my favorite, political ideologies have no place in our work. This is a remarkable picture of Freud's couch with all the trappings taken off. Only the Freud Museum has ever been allowed to show what lies underneath all the rugs and tapestries that adorn the couch itself. This first section, therapy, is coming to an end. It consisted of some critical comments on the role of therapists and therapy thinking in relation to climate change. The next section makes a positive proposal of what could be done to bring climate activism in from the margins. It's time to praise human artifice. If we really and truly seriously want to mainstream eco-psychology and the psychological approach to climate change, then now is, I suggest, also the time to praise human artifice. On one level, I'm thinking of praise, not judgment, for the entire dynamic range of human emotions. Of course, positive ones such as joy, hope, and inspiration, but also the negative ones, the more difficult ones, especially in the context of sustainability and climate change. Emotions such as greed, envy, and lust. You see, it's impossible to pick and choose, to select only which emotions are nice and appealing. Vitality is not the same as morality, is it? It's also time to praise our cities, those great achievements of human creativity, aesthetics, and social organization. To praise our squares and piazzas, to praise our restaurants and rejoice in the drinking of alcohol and coffee, to praise traffic and modern communications, and to praise too brothels and hospitals, banks and schools. This is the Bar Italia, my favorite coffee drinking place in Frith Street in Soho. This celebration is, I suggest, missing from a lot of environmental discourse, and it has been so from the beginnings. I do not think it is helpful to use a language of psychopathology, for example, as George Monbiot often does when he writes things like, "We need to kick our addiction to driving." This is just not helpful. Alongside praise of artifice, it is also time to guard against any still remaining idealization of nature with a capital N, for this is also politically useless and, in addition, intellectually weak. No one really knows what nature means, you see. In his seminal book, Man and the Natural World, the intellectual historian Keith Thomas showed that our present conception of nature has a complicated history, but it has a history, and we forget it. Nature changes its nature, so to speak. Thomas sets out the trajectory wherein by around 1800 the world was so irradiated by science, technology, and industry that people felt begrimed and darkened and smelly. So they sought a sunny, clean, and fresh antidote, and if they could afford it, they bought and developed country estates like the one you see in the picture. If they couldn't afford it, people merely dreamed of pastures and sang hymns about them. This swing to the opposite end of the spectrum, from dirt, grime, industry, to a kind of idealization of nature and a creation of it like that, this swing is what both Heraclitus and Jung called enantiodromia, the move to the other extreme. This swing led to and created the modern romantic notion of nature. Folks, we created nature. But by the end of the 19th century, we see another swing, this time against nature. The fight back was led by nature's great opponent, artifice. My favorite novel in this direction is A Rebours, French for Against Nature, by J.K. Huysmans, who, as some of you will know, was a huge influence on Oscar Wilde. This book, in all its imaginative perversity and impossible over-elaborativeness, is a paean of praise to artifice. And I would like to propose some of Huysmans' thoughts, like the ones that follow, for us to play with today. He wrote, "Nature has had her day. She has finally and utterly exhausted the patience of sensitive observers by the revolting uniformity of her landscapes and skyscapes. In fact, there is not a single one of her inventions deemed so subtle and so sublime that human ingenuity cannot manufacture. Does there exist anywhere on this earth a being conceived in the throes of motherhood who is more dazzlingly, more outstandingly beautiful than the two locomotives recently put into service on our Northern Railway?" This is an etching of the French Northern Railway at the end of the 19th century. It's beautiful, actually. I'll conclude this section by saying one more thing on the topic of human artifice, which is what I've ended up praising. At an eco-psychology conference in Oxford in 2009, I gave a workshop also entitled Against Nature, following that book. In it, some of you might be there, might have been there, in it I distributed sample files, little sample bottles, of many, many perfumes that Selfridges very kindly gave me for educational purposes. In pairs and in threes, the participants used this perfume, applied perfume to one another, smelt one another, and compared notes. It was a smelly old exercise and a lot of fun. Now, before we did the exercise, I asked who in the audience of around 150 eco-psychologists wore perfume or its male equivalents. I won't ask you, but you're going to be thinking about it. Only one person out of 150 said that she did. I then asked, who reads fashion magazines in which perfumes are widely advertised? None. Although one person said guiltily that she did it in the dentist's waiting room. This is a little-known advertisement of Marilyn Monroe selling Chanel No. 5. Anyway, to get back to the meeting, I said, and I'll say it again, that this shows why environmental activism might possibly fail and why eco-psychology had truncated itself. For those in the room had, at least as it seemed to me in that moment, got completely cut off from the role artifice plays in ordinary human life. Cut off, when you get down to it, from humanity itself. And that is as far from the mainstream as one can get. Now look, I am as frightened. I sound like Tony Blair. I used to work for Tony Blair. Now look, I am as frightened of the destruction of the planet as many people in the eco-psychology world that are friends. But I'm also convinced that if you look in the right way, there is much of value in the fripperies of fashion and consumerism, and it is elitist to deny it. And this thing has now gone. The next section moves on to consider the idea of sacrifice. This is Caravaggio, it's Abraham and Isaac and the angel. In this much more depth psychological section, I am in effect linking the psychology of climate change with the whole question of sacrifice. It is becoming a consensus amongst those who write about climate change and sustainability, but the climate crisis and imbalances of wealth under capitalism and under globalization are linked. Economic sacrifices, we all say, are needed. Because of this consensus, I've been wondering what some ideas, therapy ideas, about sacrifice might contribute with climate change and economic justice in mind. We know that people will make sacrifices for their children, or for the sake of a cause they believe in, or in the hope of greater benefits in the future, what the economists call opportunity costs. However, sacrifice is a much deeper and wider psychological and historical theme. Sacrifice lies, doesn't it, at the heart of the Abrahamic religions, the aborted sacrifice of Isaac, but is a much, much older, as a propitiation of the gods. Asceticism has a long cultural history, as does martyrdom. In Jungian psychology, we talk of the sacrifice of the ego for the flowering of the wider personality in individuation. In art and religion, we contemplate the sacrifice of autonomy and control to something experienced as other, whether inside or outside the self. That's all I've got time for on sacrifice. I've come to the very last section, which is called Addiction to Apocalypse, and I'll try and do it in 2 minutes. I want to discuss why, when it comes to climate change, it is still quite often out there in the political world a case of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. I want to give my own suggestion as to why there is the denial, disavowal, and despair that so many climate change psychologists write about in such interesting ways. This is about what is called apocalypticism, the belief that there will be, assuredly be, an apocalypse. The term apocalypse originally referred to a revelation of God's will, but now usually refers to the belief that the world will come to an end very soon, even within one's lifetime. The notion that the world is coming to an end is fairly called archetypal. It's found in all religions, paths, and ways. This is what gives apocalypse the power to possess groups and individuals. Is this what has happened in relation to climate change? Climate change and planetary degradation inspire images of apocalypse which one would imagine to be horrid, but which at some level may be oddly pleasing and reassuring. The breakdown will happen, nothing to be done about it, and that could be for some people an oddly reassuring thought. Fantasies of an apocalyptic end are rooted in reality, and it is right to point it out. But these may also be deep signs of a self-punishing contempt for ourselves. Apocalypticism is then not based on fear of an end, but on desire of it. Perhaps it is a shadow issue for many people here, including myself. This is a painting of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We desire, we actually want the whole Terran temple to crash down. It is a little exciting, you see. A macabre spectator sport, a form of political pornography, masochism in an environmental setting. Why do I end my talk on this note? Because I feel obliged to say, in a kind of prophetic mode, I admit, that it is the very love of catastrophe that contributes to our paralysis. Apocalypse now, apocalypse as soon as possible. Climate change campaigners can't move to the centre if we don't think about this thing of darkness that is holding us back. Hamlet to end on. To die, to sleep, no more. And by sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, 'tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. Thank you.